So my name's Mark Pullyblank. That is a British name that apparently stands for or somehow means pools in a clearing. It doesn't matter. I got into this animation. I've been an animator for, well, if I do the math, if I tell you all the numbers, you'll do the math and figure out how old I am, but that's fine because I'm still alive. So I've been doing this for about 18 years, I think now. I got into animation at the late age of 32. I decided to go back to school, and that sounds like a crazy thing to do, and it was ridiculous. And I entered animation school in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, thinking I'd be good at something. I was really bad at it, and I was really bad at it for an embarrassingly long time. But I worked real hard, and I got better at it. And 3 years later, I landed my first job at a studio in Vancouver called Rainmaker Visual Effects, I think they were called. I was working on the very first ever Garfield movie. Don't judge me, I had children that I needed to feed. And I worked my way up. From there, I became the animation supervisor on a few films there, and then I worked for a while at another studio in Vancouver called Frantic Films, which was good. I met a young animator there named Nick Frieden, who you might recognize as one of the founders of CG Spectrum. From there, I went out to New Zealand. I worked at Weta Digital for a while on a couple of films out there, Avatar, Tintin. Came back to Vancouver, worked at Sony Animation for a while. I was the animation director at a studio called Goldtooth. And now I live in Chico, California, Northern California. I work at the university here in Chico, and I work for CG Spectrum, the online school of animation visual effects. That's kind of my deal. And I think the interesting thing about that is I like to tell students who are getting into animation, it's a very, very scary thing to do. And I teach a couple of classes at the University of California. Sorry, California State University. And teachers like to tell students a lot that school is easy. They're like, wait till you get out into the real world. They always say, wait until you get into the real world. You think this is tough, wait till you get to the real world. And for me, being a student, when I was a student, I think nothing is more real than paying a whole sack of money to learn how to do something that's actually quite difficult to learn, and not knowing how it's going to turn out. Having that distraction of that emotional baggage on you're not really sure if you made the right choice or not. That's about as real as it ever gets. And that was hard for me. I know how hard that was. And I appreciate, now that I'm a teacher, I appreciate animators, young animators or wannabe animators coming to me and entrusting me with their animation futures. And I know that my sort of philosophy for teaching, I don't know if you want me to get into this, but my philosophy for teaching is I like to say I peddle enthusiasm. And the one thing that I've learned from working at a number of different studios, around the world, is that when you get into a studio and there's a bunch of artists there, the one trait that everybody shares is the fact that everybody has a genuine enthusiasm for what they do most of the time. They're there because they liked it. Everybody, these schools, there's a lot of people that come to school. There's a lot of people who try to do this, and there's a certain number that actually goes off and continues to do it, and they succeed at it. And those are the ones who just keep doing it. And so I came to the conclusion, and the obvious conclusion is that the number one congealing factor of all artists that work in the visual effects industry or the animation industry is a genuine enthusiasm for the work, the process itself. So I thought, well, if that's the one overarching trait, then all schools should be built around that trait. And any school that's not is doing a disservice to the people that are trying to learn, because the only wrong thing you can do as an animator is not animate. So whatever it takes to keep your hands on your tools and to keep you going and keep you excited is the right course of action for you. You can be animating poorly or badly, but as long as you're animating, that's going to be a short-term problem. But if you're not animating, you're never going to get good at it. So that's what we do here at CG Spectrum. That's how we sort of run our stuff is we just do it with a lot of enthusiasm. I love doing this stuff. I could talk about it. Well, I may be better at talking about it than I am at actually doing it, but I love to do both. All right. Does that seem, Jeff, does that seem to cover what you want me to cover?
That's good enough.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think you just introduced yourself and talked about how, like, your passion for teaching and how it goes about. But let's see you put it in action.
Oh, well, here we go. So one of the things that I like to do now, animation can get really, really tricky. And when you learn how to animate, you sort of learn through these steps, and you learn your fundamentals. You learn how to make a ball bounce, and you learn all these different fundamentals, overlapping action. Anybody who's ever animated knows all these catchphrases, but bringing it all together can be really, really difficult. And I like to think about CG animating or computer animating as it's kind of like a two-pronged problem. One is the software can be fairly intimidating, and it isn't simple to get onto, and it's a little dry looking. So the first problem is just figuring out how to navigate around the software, and then the second problem is actually learning how to use it. And all these things can get really confusing. There's all these moving parts. And as I teach people how to animate, things are going all over the place, and they don't know how to corral their animation. And I always think about animating as my number one goal as an animator is to just keep control of my process, keep control of my work. And I always know that I'm losing control of my work because I usually dress in layers because I'm an old man, and I wear cardigans and stuff. And when I'm starting to lose control of my animation, I start to take my layers off because I'm getting hot. And I'm really in trouble when you look over at my workstation and I'm completely naked. Then everything's gone really off the charts. So what I try to think of is I try to bring things down to the simplest. I never work naked, by the way. I just want to. That was a joke. Yeah. I want to keep things as simple as possible. So I'm always trying to think of it, especially if I'm communicating. And as an animation supervisor as well, I have a bunch of people and they're looking at shots, and I'm looking at shots, and I'm trying to communicate with them as simply as possible what they can do to make their work better. Or sometimes worse, depends on who the director is. But anyways, to get their shot approved, and how can I communicate that as simply as possible? And with all these moving parts, it can be very difficult. So to give you an idea of what we're dealing with here, this is a very basic, what we call a rig, which is basically a character with a bunch of controls set up on it so we can move it. This character has, like I said, has a fairly simple rig, but you can see we have all these moving parts happening for this rig. We have all these things to move, and this is a timeline down here. And every time I move my cursor through here, I need a new pose. This thing is going to move. So these are all frames, and in animation usually runs about 24 frames per second, sometimes 30 frames per second. And for every single frame, there's a new pose. 24 frames per second, that's 24 poses per second. That's a lot of poses. That's a lot of things moving around. So what we like to do, the very first thing we like to do is when we get an assignment or we get a shot to do, we have to act it out and shoot some reference first. And for this, what I did is I grabbed this piece of audio, which is only a 30-second piece of audio, and it sounds like this.
Not in the face! Not in the face! Not in the face! Not in the face!
And I listened to that for about 3 hours.
Not in the face! Not in the face! Not in the face!
It's a living. And I listened to it over and over again, and I sort of try to construct a performance in my head. And once I think I have something, then I'll go and shoot some reference. I don't have my reference for this because it's been a while, but I'll shoot some reference, and I'm looking for key poses. I can't go through frame by frame and make this thing move because it's going to get too tricky and too convoluted, and it's going to be really, really messy. So what I'm looking for is I'm looking to try to say as much as I possibly can with the fewest number of poses as possible. So for this performance here, I've started with one pose here, which is just my basic pose. Then I go to this pose for the knot. and this pose for the face. So I'm looking at those accents. I'm looking for not in the face. So I'm looking for basically two poses, not in face, and then my basic pose. So that's where I start. So I just, we call this blocking, and I just block out these few poses, and I show those to my director or my supervisor or whoever cares. And once they look at them, they sign off on them. Now, some of the things that I'm looking for is I'm looking for dynamic poses where my character is like, you know, they have a little bit of a twist to it. I want to get a final pose, you know, that's up this way. I get a C curve. So I'm looking for what's called appealing poses that they're a good silhouette. So if I turn the lights off here like this, you can still basically see what my character is doing. These are all sorts of the ingredients that I'm trying to build in to my first base poses. And as I'm building those in, there's somebody else, a supervisor, a director who's guiding me as well, saying, try this, try that, you know, maybe get this leg a bit higher, whatever they're saying. Just trying to sort of formulate something that'll work. And this is called a graph editor here. And in my graph editor, you can see these are all the keys that I can manipulate. I have a question. Oh, Sarah. Hey, Sarah. And then this is just another tool that I can use. I don't know if I want to get into the graph editor because it freaks people out, but I love it, but freaks some people out. But this is just me getting my first initial poses to show to a director and say, this is my vision for this shot. Now, that said, my next step is to work in between these poses. This should be opening. And again, how I like to think about animation is it's just a series of poses arranged on a timeline. And then if those poses work well together, then I try to get in between those poses as simply and as elegantly as I possibly can. And that's the whole deal. And so instead of thinking about this as a whole bunch of poses, I'll just squeeze it down to like, okay, I have two poses, let's get in between those two poses. And then I'll move over to the next two poses. And that's the way that I work to keep control over my animation here. So at this point, what I have, if you look, I have a lot of keys set in here. Let me make sure I grab the right one, sorry. No, let's grab this one. Talk amongst yourselves. There he is. Okay. So I'm going to select my rig, and you can see I have a lot more keys in here, but you can still see, like, because I'm working on these moments or these accents, you can see that I really have got this down into two different smaller animation assignments, let's say. So the first one is basically getting from my first pose to my not pose. That's my first animation assignment, is just to get from this pose to this pose. And then my next animation assignment is to get from this pose to this pose. And so you can see that I've been able to sort of section off my animation. So I'm not sitting here with 70 frames of animation. Instead, I'm sitting here with 7 frames of animation here and another 9 frames of animation here. So that's a lot easier for me, especially if I have a 300 frame shot, which sometimes I do. And if I'm looking at all 300 frames at one time, that can get pretty overwhelming, and I can start stripping down pretty fast. So instead, I just find out where my accents are, and I just concern myself with getting between this pose and this pose and this section, and then I just pay it forward as I go. So this first section here, you can see as I'm going from this pose to this pose, I just go through and I'm looking for overlap. So as I walk through this, you can see as my body's coming down, I'm pushing one part of the body down, top part's going up, and I'm getting what's called drag. And as it drags down, then we finally come down here and we settle. Now that's called overlapping action, the drag. And now, the idea with overlapping action is that not everything changes direction at the exact same time, and not everything gets to my final pose at the exact same time. So you can see here, as I step through, you can see that my lower part of my body, if we look at this area here, I'll turn this rig off so we can see a bit better. You can watch this line here, how it gets to its final resting point right around frame 43 or 44. The upper body and the head and the hands, they come in a little bit later. So that's overlapping action. So not everything comes to stop at the same time. There's a little tiny bit of movement through here. That's called a moving hold. So it just doesn't stick. Nothing in nature stops as dead as you can make things stop in Maya. I don't want things to freeze. I don't necessarily want anyone to see movement here. I just don't want it to feel like it sticks. And that's kind of the difference. Movement versus, I don't want it to float. I want it to be a really subtle hold. So it just doesn't go lock up. And then from here you can see I do the same thing. The body starts to change direction, going screen left. The head drags screen right. We finally get to that spot. And it looks like, here, I'll do a quick, this is called a Playblast, a quick video Playblast of it. Hopefully it doesn't play with too much lag on your end. And it looks something like this.
Not in the face! Not in the face!
So you can see,
Not in the face!
there's a rhythm building. It's still a little bit sticky,
Not in the face!
but you can sort of see the movement
Not
starting
in the face!
to flow. You get the rhythm of the piece.
Not in the face!
And even though there's no facial animation on this character, you still get the impression that they're saying what they're saying. And I always like to think about, in animation studios, in animation terms, we always like to think about the facial as being kind of like the icing on the cake. You should be able to read the performance without any facial animation. That's the goal.
Not in the face! Not in the face!
So once I get to this point, my animation is flowing pretty well. And I haven't set, if you look, it looks like I have a lot of keyframes in here, but if you actually go in to my graph editor, the graph editor is a good telltale. You can see that I don't actually have a lot going on. I still have my main poses. This is the main pose here. This is my main pose here. And you can see it's still fairly, it's not a huge mess in my graph editor. And for those of you who don't know what a graph editor is, don't worry about it. It's way easier than it looks. I spend a lot of time with students demystifying the graph editor. It demystifies pretty quickly. Is that a thing, demystifying? The important, for me, the important part of having all this stuff kind of clean and simple and not having a big mess is because when you work on a film, a director, any number of directors will take you down a path and will work with you through a shot, and you'll get a whole bunch of information in there. And you'll have tons of keys, and the thing will be just a mess. And then, you know, sure as anything, the director will come to you one day and go, "Hey, I have a new idea for that shot." And at this point, this shot is being held together with, you know, nuts and bolts and packing tape or whatever. It's just barely, it's like sometimes you'll get a scene file like this and it'll be like a Jenga puzzle. If you guys know what Jenga is, it's just teetering. Like, I'm not prepared to make any changes. It's a mess. It's a disaster. So I've learned over the years that as an animator, if I portray the path of least resistance, meaning that if every time a director comes to me and says, "Can you make a change?" and I go, they're not going to come to me. But if I'm the kind of guy, if a director can come and say, "I know this is going to be massive, and I wish you would have thought about this 2 weeks ago before you put all this work into it, but I have an idea." My goal is, as an animator, is to say, "Let's hear it," and then be enthusiastic about it and go, "I think it's a great idea." And they go, "Is it okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's fine. I'll make it work," and not complain. And if I'm the path of least resistance as an animator, I get more shots. And if I get more shots, I get more shots on film. And for me, you know, aside from making sure that my paychecks cash, that's the most important part. That's what I want. That's my goal, is to get as much footage on film as possible. So in order to do that, I have to make sure that my animation looks dynamic and fits the film, but also that my workflow is set up where I can make big changes without costing the film a lot of time. So it's kind of a, you know, it's kind of a thing. I'm not sure if I should keep my advice what advice would you give to those who want to study, observe body language for these kinds of animation? That's a great question. If you're studying body language and you're studying performances, one of the best things to do, and it's something that I do and I practice now and again, is when you watch a movie, and you love that movie, we rarely dig in and say, "Why did I like it?" You just like it. And then you watch it again and go, "Man, that movie's amazing." And we typically don't really quantify all the elements that make it amazing. We just love it. if you try to quantify or try to pick out the parts that you like, or you try to analyze it while the movie's going, you get lost in the movie. You forget that you're actually watching this for a, you know, as sort of like a for reference. So what I like to do is I take pieces out of a movie and I'll play a sequence, and I'll just watch it, and I'll think about, why did the director do that? And there's all kinds of stuff that seem to happen naturally. I was watching a movie one time, and there's a bunch of people arguing in the backyard of a house, and as they're arguing, suddenly way behind them, a gate opens up, and the person who's coming through the gate, you can't see them; they're blurry, you know, because it's a depth of field. And everybody stops arguing, and they go, "Not right now. We're using this," or "Not, go away," or whatever. And the person that opened the gate just closes the gate and walks away. And I thought to myself, well, why the hell would they write that into the film? That was a weird thing. Why did they all of a sudden say, person opens gate, they say go away, the person closes gate, and they continue on with their conversation? And to me, that was a really strange. I know this doesn't have anything to do with body language, but it helps with your observation skills. You should ask those kinds of questions, and you should pick out, like, what is it about that performance that made it compelling, and break it down and think about it. And it's a really fun exercise. What I learned from that is that in all films, they have something like that. In almost every scene where there's conflict, the conflict grows, and then something happens. I was watching a film called Michael Clayton, and these two people were having an argument, and there was a woman standing in the background. She never had a single line. She never said anything. And she got tired of hearing him scream, and she smashed a glass, and everybody stopped. That was the exact same mechanism as the person opening the gate. They all have it. I call it the glass smasher. And what it does is, once the argument or the conflict has gotten to a point where nobody can find resolve, somebody snaps them out of it, and then they come down. And usually what happens is that during a conflict, somebody has the power and somebody's weak. And when the glass smashes it, it's a shift. And so the power of the conflict shifts by the end of the scene. And it's usually the glass smash that does it. Funny stuff that you find and you observe, and all this stuff is valuable when you're trying to put in the all important ingredients of what's the word for compelling? Compulsion? You want your shots to be compelling, or your animation to be compelling, and it's a weird thing to try to figure out. So all these things aid in your decisions as an animator, and even as a small filmmaker, into making your shot compelling. And I always like to say to animators, if your work is compelling, meaning that people will pause and take a look at it, people feel compelled to pause and take a look at your work, well, then you can do anything. And that's what you're trying to do. And all this observation is going to help you do that. Sketching is really good too, just trying to break your poses down into really nice, simple sketches, and trying to figure out, you know, basically how people move without all the intricacies, but just in a broad way. All sorts of that kind of study is good. So sketching is really good. And when I talk about sketching, I don't mean pretty drawings. I mean just trying to find like paths of action and how people move. And we used to do a thing at Rainmaker. I remember every once in a while with the animation team, we'd say, take a moment, and I want everybody to take a moment and pose. Give me one pose of somebody who works here. And then we'd all sit around and try to guess who it was. And I worked with a young animator at the time. His name was Bartek, and he was amazing at it. And he would just take a character like this, and he would pose it. And he'd go, oh, that's Nick. Instantly, you'd know it. He just had that. He had that eye where he could just pick out a certain way people would hang their hips, or something people would do. One guy used to always play with. He had a fob hanging around his neck, you know, to get into different rooms. He'd always hold it with two hands and rub it with his thumb. So all these things that nobody else really noticed, but he would pick out really quickly. And it made him a really, really powerful animator. I think he's a supervising animator at MPC now in Montreal, if I'm not mistaken. All right, moving on. So once I get to this point where I have quite a few keyframes, but I still have control over it, the next thing I want to do is I want to just add in some details. So the process of what I'm doing, the Disney guys start out when they were animating, they found that there were sort of two methods of animation. There were pose to pose, which was the first thing that I did, is just block out my poses. And then there was a style of animation called straight ahead, which means just starting here at the beginning and going frame and doing a pose and frame and doing a pose. I'm doing this because they used to draw their stuff. What they found was pose to pose animation was a really good way to keep control of your animation, but your animation typically looks stiff and boring. Straight ahead animation was more fluid and more fun, and you'd stumble onto some stuff. But more often than not, you'd be left with garbage at the end of it. because you didn't really you hadn't blocked out a pose at the end, so you didn't really know where you're heading for. What we've learned throughout the years is the best method is a combination of two. So the first pass that I did on this, the blocking out pass, is what you would call pose to pose. What I've done here is straight ahead. And I'm not going straight ahead through the whole thing. I'm just going straight ahead from 40 to 47. And then I'm going straight ahead from 54 to 63. Now, the third final stage of my animation is what you would call maybe layered animation, which is I'm going to add some detail into it. So as I add detail into it, this was from a class I just had. There we go. Some residuals. So, and this is called details. And as I add details into it, you'll see that my timeline will get really, really busy. And it will look pretty nuts. So let's just go in here. I'm going to turn on my rig again. I'm going to select the entire character and take a look at my timeline. And you can see it's just a wash of keys. It's just completely filled up with keys. If you look in my graph editor, you'll see that it's still pretty busy, but you can, if I walk through here, you can still see where my main poses were and you can find them. So I still have a semblance of control, although not as much as I would have. So what I'm doing now is my sort of, let's just say the root of my animation is solid. Like this is called a COG, or center of gravity, and where it goes, everything moves. So I make sure that it's nice and clean. You can see there's not a ton of keys on it. And then as my animation goes up into the shoulders, in the upper body, we get more because we articulate more through here. If I have too much animation with this thing, or too much movement, I should say, with this controller here, it's just going to radiate up to the head and it's going to be crazy. So that stays simple. I have more and more keys, or more detail as we come up here. And then of course, as we get out to the hands are all detail. So this is what this one looks like, just so you can see the difference. I'll do another quick play blast of this so we can see it so you can see what I've added for detail.
Not in the face! Not in the face!
So it's basically the same. I added some wiggle with the hands, some overlapping action with the fingers. So you can see as the hands are going, the fingers are overlapping. That's called weed principle. The head's doing a little bit of a shake as well. So there's a little bit of detail through that. And that's my final pass, is adding that detail pass. Before I would add a detail pass, I would have a very clear conversation with my director and say, am I clear to go through a detail pass? And she or he will say, yes, absolutely. And knowing full well that once I do my detail pass, they'll look at it and go, oh, because every time you do a new passive animation, it inspires a new idea in somebody. And they go, you know what would be cool? Which is like the worst sentence you could ever hear as an animator, is, you know what would be cool? Because you know it's too late. How are we doing?
Pretty good. Yeah, this is great, Mark. How are we going with time? We locked into the half hour? Or?
You can have as long as you want. There's no one in after you, so
right.
As long as Mark wants to chat.
He'll go for
yeah. Well, we've done a half hour. We're good. I see Sarah. Hi. I meant to say hi, but I was on a bit of a roll. Sarah Herman piped in. I don't think there's ever been, honestly, Sarah, I don't think there's ever been a minute that I've been online, live streamed anywhere, where you haven't popped in and said hi. It's amazing. Everywhere I go, there you are, and I really appreciate it. I always know, no matter what, Sarah's listening. Does anybody have any questions, or is there anything you'd like me to cover as we go through here?
You got any questions in the room?
No, this is all news to me. It's been very insightful. Yeah.
Exactly.
Can I ask you guys a couple questions?
Sure.
Are you students? Some of you are students, yes?
Some are prospective students. I'm not sure who's watching online, but it's a mix of current students, staff, and prospective students.
Nice, fun. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I've been working on this. I'll show you something else I've been working on, which is kind of fun. This one takes a little bit of time to open up. So if you have any questions as we go here, just let me know. Blind, I think is the one. Are some of you students or prospective students, are you familiar with Maya?
Not so much with Maya, a little bit of Cinema 4D.
Oh, Cinema 4D is wonderful. I don't really know it, but I've worked with some people who work with Cinema 4D, and they made some very cool stuff with it. I'll tell you this: when I got into Maya, I didn't own a computer. Here's a funny thing: I was talking to the supervising animator of the latest Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Have you guys seen this, Into the Spider-Verse?
Oh, I want to watch it so bad.
It's absolutely brilliant. It's probably, oh, that didn't work out. It's probably the best animated film I've seen since The Incredibles.
Oh wow.
It's brilliant. I can't even, what makes it so good, not only is the story good and the character development, or sorry, the character design, everything like that is good, but they've done they've animated it in CG, but they've animated it on twos, which means they've done like the old school. They hold every pose they hold for 2 frames. In the old days, the Disney guys, they would draw like 24 drawings per second until they learned, very early on, they learned, well, the human eye doesn't actually pick it out. If you draw 12 frames per second, the human eye won't really pick it out. So that's what they called animated on twos. So they draw 12 drawings per second, which meant they would draw one drawing for 2 frames. It looks different. It's if you're not an animation nerd, it probably doesn't look that different, but it does look different. And what Sony did is they animated all their shots and then they put it on twos, and it looks crazy cool. Plus the editing is unbelievable. But anyway, so I was a huge nerd for this film, and Sony did it, so I knew some people there. So I contacted this lovely man that I worked with a few years ago named Jeff Panko, and he was a supervising animator on it. And he agreed to let me interview him and ask him a bunch of questions. And I said, how do you want to do this? Do you want to do it on Zoom? And he said, it doesn't matter, but I don't have a computer. I don't own a computer. And I said, well, my first question is, how do you not own a computer? How do people not own computers? That I thought that was really, really surprising. And he hasn't answered me yet. So I'm not sure how the supervising animator for Spider-Man doesn't actually own a computer, but I'd like to see how. I'm curious. It's kind of like a plumber not owning a toilet, isn't it? I don't know. That's different, I guess. I had another thought in there. What was I talking about before that? Oh, before I got into animation, I didn't own a computer, and I bought my first computer to learn how to be an animator. And I remember I went to my first day of school, and they said, go to the start menu, and I didn't know what a start menu was. So I've come a long way. And I remember the first time, and I had been studying as a traditional animator, and I actually worked a little bit on a film called it was a TV show called The Christmas Orange TV special as a traditional animator for a studio in Vancouver. But it became clear to me very quickly that I wasn't good enough to really make a decent living. It was rough. I remember I was working on the Sinbad movie, and they were doing these drawings using they were using these leads that were so thin they're like a hair, you could barely see them. And every time I'd get like within an inch of the paper, they would just snap. And I thought, well, this isn't for me. So I opened up Maya, and I thought, no way, this is not for me. And I tapped out pretty early, and then somebody talked me back down. And I thought, man, this stuff's ridiculous. But now here I am. I figured it out, and I know where the start menu is. So. Ellen, hey, what's a good software to start with as a total amateur? And should you wait your time on learning the tech or sketching? Oh, okay. Well, those are great questions. So Maya is great. Maya is the industry standard. The wonderful thing about animating is well, sorry, the wonderful thing about working in Maya as an animator is that animation really has the smallest tool set. I love that about animation. It's you set keys and you move things around. It still feels very tactile, even though you're in a computer. It's not programming or anything sort of, for me, stuff that would be a language that would be difficult for me to learn. So Maya is good. It's an industry standard. You can get it for free as an educational software. And there is a plethora of tutorials out there to get you started, just to figure out how to get around it. And you'll find it's very intuitive, user-friendly is a good term. And you'll find that you'll get your head around it fairly quickly. And then you just kind of get caught in it, because once you kind of get a feel for it, you realize, well, what can't I do? It's really fun. It's basically I'm doing all this from a laptop, and like I can make a movie with my laptop. It's really incredible. Learning the tech or sketching. Well, what I do is this: if I feel like sketching, I sketch, and if I feel like animating, I animate. And I don't think it has to be any. I know wonderful animators that don't draw very well or don't even spend a lot of time sketching, and I know animators that are brilliant traditional artists. One thing I do know is any animator that I know that's a good traditional artist are really good animators, but that doesn't mean you have to be. I've never met somebody who was a good traditional artist and an animator that was a bad animator, but I'm sure they're out there. But sketching is great. Here's the thing about sketching that's really good for you as an artist and as a person. They say you should sketch every day a little bit, just because it's good for the soul. I don't know what the science is behind that, but as an artist, sketching it helps it forces your brain to think in terms of simplicity. So when you're trying to think of a complex piece of animation or complex move that your character's doing, if you're forced to actually scrape it out with a pen or a pencil on a flat piece of paper, that forces you to do it very plainly and broadly, and it will change the way you look at your scene file. One of the inherent problems with Maya, when we talk about animation is really only about how something moves across the screen horizontally and vertically. That's it. That's all we are concerned about. We don't care how things move in depth. And in the old days, in the hand-drawn days, I say the old days, people still draw. But in the hand-drawn days of animation, if they wanted something to move away from you, they just drew it progressively smaller. And if they wanted something to move towards you, they drew it progressively bigger. But they still were concerned with how it moved horizontally and vertically. So, for example, I'll look at a piece of animation. Somebody will submit to me a piece of animation in Maya, and they'll have this character who goes like, and comes forward. And I'll say, you need to add some horizontal and vertical movement. Your character's not moving. And they'll say, sure, my character's moving. They're moving in depth space. Not concerned about depth. Not concerned about this movement at all. I'm concerned about this movement and this movement. So drawing on a flat piece of paper forces you to think about movement in those terms. And it's one of the values that I had starting as a traditional animator, is that I'm able to look at my 3D animation as a flat piece of animation. And we have all these tools in here. Like we got a great tool here called Grease Pencil, which you can draw on the screen with. And Grease Pencil is exactly for that. You draw these dots on here so you can track the paths of action of your character as they move, like it's on a flat piece of paper, because that's how we want to see this stuff. Of course, Grease Pencil crashes Maya, which is always fun. The other bonus positive thing about drawing, sketching, and getting some skills with sketching is that when you work on a film or you work in a studio, often what you're trying to do is communicate ideas as quickly as possible. And I worked for a little while as a previs artist for a couple of productions. I worked as a previs artist on The Hobbit, 2 of the 3 Hobbit films, the second and the third. And previs at Weta Digital was basically coming up with ideas. We were shooting this big, the third film was a huge battle. And, Peter Jackson, who was the director of that film, would come to us in the previs department and say, one of the issues was there was like 7 dwarfs or something and 7 million orcs. And if they're killing these orcs really easily, then it doesn't look, it looks like the orcs aren't dangerous anymore. So we're trying to come up with ideas to make the orcs look dangerous. So we just come up with the ideas, and then we put our idea, we bring all the digital doubles. I'm really bad at multitasking. We bring all the digital doubles and all the environments into Maya, and then we do a quick block out of what we think the shot would be with a camera. And the cameras have to look cinematic because Peter doesn't like things that don't look cinematic. So if you send him something that doesn't look cinematic, he'll send it back. And I'll say this, and then if he likes it, then he'll take it onto the set, and he'll shoot it. Your final work doesn't get on film as a previs animator, but your ideas get on film. And I'll say this, as exciting as it is to see your animation on film, and it's pretty exciting, it pales in comparison to seeing your ideas on film. To seeing, like, I thought of that, and a group of people got together, and they made it, and they did it because they thought it was a good idea. And then everybody in the theater, which I haven't seen the Hobbit movies, so I don't know if anybody liked my ideas or not, but everybody in the theater laughed or reacted to my idea, and suddenly you feel like, what do they call that? That's adult affirmation. You feel like you matter. It feels really good. In that process, you're trying to get your ideas out as quickly as possible, because the faster you can get your ideas out, the more likely they are to be realized. The fastest way to get your ideas out is drawing them. And it's very typical to go over to whoever's in charge. And when I worked on that film, it was a guy named Christian Rivers, who's a second unit director, or there was another guy named Jamie Beard, who was an animation director. And I would go over and go, I got this idea. And we always had these pads of paper. And you'd start with, like, okay, and you draw like this box, that's your, you know what I mean? And you're like, okay, I want in the foreground, I'm going to have this orc, and he's fine. And then back here, we're going to have this little dwarf coming running at him with an axe. And you're kind of you're sketching stuff out super fast. And then you're not making you're not going to hang it on a wall. No, I'm not anyhow. I'm just trying to communicate an idea as quickly as I can. And so I've learned some shorthand for doing that. And a lot of it, you go like, okay, and you don't just rely on drawings. You sort of, you rely on words and lots of hand gestures. But sketching really aids in that. It's all about this whole thing about making films, making games. It's all about communicating ideas. That's it. When you go to see a movie, the director is directing a bunch of ideas toward you and trying to communicate those ideas to you. Sorry, Simon?
Do you have a question?
Oh, no, sorry. I thought maybe I was running out of time or something. Here's a little...
There's a couple of questions in there, I think, that have been
Yeah, we've
sent
got a
through.
couple Q&As. Can you
Oh, cool. I see them. Am I looking at the right...
There's chat, and then there's Q&A. I can read it out.
Oh, look at that. I didn't see that little Q&A button. Cool. Okay. So I think I answered what is the easiest program for a beginner animator. Maya. I would just start with Maya. I would start with... That's where all the resources are. There's, like I said, there's loads of stuff on the internet. I would just start there. It's intimidating when you first open it, but it gets smaller as you go. Chris K says, hi there. Is there any value in a focus on 2D over 3D? Absolutely. Just like I guess I just probably answered that in the ability to be able to see your animation as horizontal and vertical on a flat plane, I think is really, really important to not get distracted by depth movement or other stuff. If you can just, you're the best way to look at learning how to animate is that the process of learning how to animate is actually learning how to see, and you're learning how to see things that you hadn't recognized before, and that's it. That's the whole thing. So you're learning how to look at something and see something in a way that you never saw before. And so many times, because I've spent so many years looking at this stuff and working alongside other really skilled, wonderful animators, they always say, like, so-and-so has an eagle eye. That's a sharp eye. They talk about that. all the time when they say, well, what's he like as an animator? What's she like as an animator? Oh, she's got a freaking eagle eye. They always talk in those terms. I worked with a guy one time, his name is Terry Kalinich, and he only had one eye. He was a great animator. And a lot of times we'd be in dailies and he'd point something out and I would say, oh, good eye. And then I'd go, oh, Terry, I'm so sorry. And he would say, that's okay. But anyway, so you're developing your eye, and if, you know, a lot of times people say to me, like, how did you see that? How do you see that? And then after they've worked with me for 3 or 4 months, or like, they start seeing it as well. And I'm like, see, and they go, yeah, it's pretty obvious. You're not as smart as I thought you were. It's okay. But that's the whole thing, is like, you just haven't looked. You don't know where to look. And so the process of learning how to animate really is learning where to look. And I find a 2D background, because it's 2D, it forces you to simplify everything. Everything has to be simplified, and everything has to be thought of in terms of like moving geometry. And you're also forced to animate without seeing movement. And one of the difficulties, the inherent difficulties of Maya, is also one of its strengths. But one of the difficulties is that you don't have to do a bunch of drawings and then shoot them, and then do a bunch of drawings and then shoot them to find out if they're moving okay. Now, that might seem like a plus for Maya, but what happens is that because animation is a series of poses arranged on a timeline that only give you the illusion of movement if you scrub that timeline, then the best way to look at it is that posing is the process of animation and movement is the result. And what happens in Maya is that young animators, or people new to animation, let's say, they rush to see it move, which means that they're not concentrating on the poses. And if you don't have strong poses, you don't have anything. And I always say, like, if your poses are weak, then you're just polishing turds. You don't have anything strong your foundation isn't there. So in Maya, we work in what's called stepped curves, which means that you don't have movement. Maya is holding that pose until you get to the next pose. And that's what I showed you in that first demonstration of my character, and that when it would just snap and snap and snap. That is a throwback to the old days of drawing to drawing to drawing. And that's what old animators used to do, or that's what traditional animators do, is they do their key drawings, and then they draw their in-betweens once they know that their key drawings work. And then they draw their in-betweens to get in between those drawings. So it's good to have a 2D background because it forces you, it helps you practice solid posing and strong posing. And whenever I look at a piece of animation, I can see instantly if the animator has rushed and it hasn't spent enough time in their poses. And I'll say, okay, let's go back. Let's get rid of all this stuff. I just delete it all out. I'm like, let's just look at where your poses are and let's make those poses stronger. And they'll go, and I'm like, nope, poses. And traditional animators, 2D animators know this. CG animators learn it, and they learn it quickly. Mark, will you be teaching the history of animation unit? I didn't know there was such a thing. I would love that. I don't know. I think that's my...
Yeah, I'll repeat that. Yes, there's lots of theory in the Collarts component of the course. So there's all that good stuff is there, and hopefully I'll be teaching it because that's the stuff I love.
Damn it.
We can do it together.
That's all right. Cool. I'm a huge teacher fight. I'm a huge history nerd. I'm not a very good fighter though. I fight like an art student.
Cool.
Do we have any more questions? Because we're probably getting to a point
I think
to
that's
start wrapping up. And clearly you have the ability to talk under wet cement, which is a quality I share and respond well to. So maybe we'll start to. I'll say officially a thank you, and I'll also say email that as well. But have we got questions in the?
No, they're all just comments, just saying thank you and things like
right.
Does he want to show whatever he had up
that.
there quickly?
Oh yeah.
Is there anything you need to conclude with, Mark, before we wrap stuff up?
Well, I mean, I was just showing this this is a lesson that I'm working on. So this is what's coming up in our advanced animation class. Jeff, I hope I'm not giving away but it's just how I block out a sequence of it's a 2-character scene along with cameras, and so I just wanted to go through like how I set up things like foreground objects for parallax and different performances, and when to move the camera and so on and so forth. So although it looks fairly basic, there's a lot that goes into this kind of stuff. So I was just showing off how far we can go with this stuff. And this is indicative of some of the shots that I would do working in previs. We always had to do things in a single camera, and so that was always the trick when working on both Peter Jackson's and anybody else's. I worked on Tintin with Steven Spielberg and previs as well, and Steven and Peter Jackson both worked on that film, and it was always a single camera, and they always would say, like, if you have to change cameras, then you should probably choreograph your scene better. And they'd always try to get you to do it in a single camera, and that's some of the stuff that we're paying forward here. That's all.
Easy.
Easy. I know, I'm totally dropping names.
Cool. I don't know about anyone else. You've actually got me kind of even more excited about the course. I think I should be on the course as well as leading it. I don't know.
I'll give you a discount if you don't hurt me.
Right. I guess I'm just going to say thank you, and that was just absolutely gold. Thank you. So. Great.
Listen, I really appreciate you guys inviting me in and letting me go on a spiel for an hour. Listen, I love Melbourne, so and I travel well. So let me just throw that out there.
We'll get you the next open day. Yeah, hopefully we can get you over here.
Cool. Thanks so much, you guys, for inviting me in. It was good fun.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.
Talk soon.